cognitive science, we're concerned about knowing and who the knower is and how knowledge comes to be. And the word knowledge then unpacks in a lot of different ways. We wouldn't expect the word knowledge to pick out one thing. So you know that the capital of France is Paris, and you know how to tie your shoes, and you probably know how to find your way back from the pub at night. So you know lots of different things, and each of those uses the word knowledge in a different kind of way. Now, as cognitive scientists have developed stories about different kinds of knowing, the theme of representation is one that keeps coming up. It's often treated as if this were a simple matter. If I know something, then that knowledge is within me, and I must have something in me that represents that knowledge. That's a vague and intuitive way of dealing with this. What we'll see is that the word representation draws us to a whole bunch of interesting questions in cognitive science, which can be elaborated in one mode or another. We'll see frequent use of this within the computational theory of mind, and we'll see other uses of the term representation. And so it's worth our while spending a little bit of time getting to know the various senses of this word. To begin with, we realize that we're getting into a slightly difficult territory here because there's so many things to think about. If we take a simplistic approach to the mind and assume that the mind exists somewhere maybe in the brain or separate from the world or something like that, then we have to back that up by coming to some story about how the mind knows the world. And in elaborating some theories of mind, this means trying to develop a story in which something inside, perhaps inside the brain or wherever mind is to be found, is about the world. It's not the world, but it's about the world. It represents the world. So because of the difficulty of the territory, I think it's worth our while to start educating ourselves and getting some basic concepts on board using more familiar stuff. How about maps? First, we're going to set the scene. There's a city. It's Salt Lake City in Utah. I believe it exists. I've never been there myself. Perhaps you've been there. But it's sufficiently well known that we can say Salt Lake City exists and we're not there right now, right? This picture of Salt Lake City is one way of talking about Salt Lake City. It helps to anchor our discussion, but it's a very limited view. It's a kind of a snapshot. Here's a different view of Salt Lake City. It's a map. Now, a map is clearly about Salt Lake City. We could say that the map represents many things in Salt Lake City. I don't think any map would aspire to representing the whole of Salt Lake City, but it might properly lay claim to representing some aspects of Salt Lake City. This means, of course, that there are many ways that one could construct a map. One could construct a map taking different things into account. So this particular map seems to have chosen to represent some buildings, certainly a lot of streets, some of the terrain, using those lines that indicate elevation. So there's a lot of features of Salt Lake City which are represented in this map. Here's a different map, also a map of Salt Lake City, this time at a different scale, showing much more of the topography of the mountains around it, showing different roads. And notice that Salt Lake City itself, while it's still on this map, it has been reduced to a circle with a star in it, a five-pointed star. Now, whatever I may think about Salt Lake City, I'm pretty convinced Salt Lake City looks nothing like a circle with a five-pointed star in it. That seems secure. And yet, as competent map users, we have no trouble with this. We come across a map and there's the word Salt Lake City, and there's a circle with a five-pointed star, and we're happy with that. We can understand this. We're very skilled at using symbols, sets of symbols, at interpreting complicated diagrams, icons, symbols, signs. We're very, very good at this, and we do it in all kinds of different domains. So maps are useful here because we have experience in understanding maps in very different ways. For good measure, here's a third map of Salt Lake City. Again, a different scale. Some of the information on previous maps will be here, some won't. This map conveniently comes with a legend to help our interpretation of this representation. And on the legend, we can find, for example, the color coding of roads, but we also find symbols telling us what the symbol for an airport is, for example. Now, maps are not purely symbolic. If we see the little figure of an airplane here, that's a symbol standing for an airport. The airplane looks nothing like an airport, but it awakens in us a thinking of airplanes and the domain of airports. So it's very useful and it's very appropriate to use that as a symbol in the map. But there's other kinds of information in here which are not symbolic. For example, if I want to figure out the distance on the ground between 2 points, let's say Salt Lake City and a neighboring town, I can take a piece of string and I can lay it down on the map, and then I can take that piece of string and straighten it and put it on a scale, and the scale will tell me how to translate that into distance on the ground. In fact, the legend conveniently provides the scale here. So the information about distance on the ground between Salt Lake City and a neighboring town is available in this map, but I have to work hard to get at it. I have to do something. So it's not explicit, it's implicit. So the way in which distance is represented in this map is different from the way in which airports are represented in this map. You see how maps can be useful for pointing out different ways in which something can be about something else? Let's come back to those symbols. Here's a bunch of just random symbols. The first two could usefully be used by a map maker to symbolize an airport. They could be used by a sign maker to show how to get to the airport. They could be used on bus stations to show which bus goes to the airport. They don't mean anything unless they're used in a context, like in a bus station or on a map. The third symbol down is one you might find on the dashboard of your car. That's its natural habitat, as it were. It works within a menagerie, an ecosystem of signs that are available in your car, telling you about, among other things, the state of your car. This one, if that light flashes, it's telling you you need to add oil to your engine. And interestingly, the symbol used for this is an oil can, but it's an old-fashioned oil can of a kind that nobody really uses anymore. And yet, usage became established, and so the oil can now functions within a symbol of signs that we might find in a car. Notice that, for example, when you're saving a file to disk on a computer, you click on the save icon, and the save icon looks like what used to be called a floppy disk. It's a kind of technology that's gone away again. It's like this antique oil can, and yet it became iconic. That is, it becomes a recognizable element that can be used in specific contexts. Saving a file, saving your Word file to the disk, for example. The last one of these is interesting. It's a red circle with a line through it. If I was to ask you what does it mean, you'd say, well, where does it occur? Because it has a general sense of prohibition, and this red arrangement is often combined with other signs, as we'll see, to say this is prohibited or that is prohibited. The red circle with the line through it itself is kind of a generic template for prohibited. And some Russian wags made this sign, which is prohibiting is prohibited. So symbols are really interesting, and they function within different kinds of systems of signs that are used in specific contexts. But there are other ways in which something we're looking at can be about something which is not ready to hand. Take these two traces of past activity, for example. The first is evidence that someone pressed their lips against a pane of glass and kissed it for whatever reason. The second is evidence that someone placed their hand into some soft clay, and both the person kissing the glass and the person using their hand, they're long gone. And we can look at these and we can see that these stand in correspondence to a past event. In that respect, you could say they're about the past event. But if we use the word represent here, we're using it in a different sense, a very different sense from that which we just used when we spoke of maps. So one thing to note is that the past event is not present in its entirety. There's some aspects of the past event that have been retained here. So you could tell something about the flakiness of the skin on the lips or the length of the fingers, but you could tell nothing about the shoe size of the person involved in either case, or what clothes they're wearing, or what time of day it was, for example. So some aspects of the past remain here as a form of memory, as it were, and some aspects are not there. There is a source event here, the lips kissing the glass or the hand pressing down on the clay. The source event is past. What remains is a trace of the event, and from the trace, some characteristics of the source event are retained, perhaps modified somewhat, and others are lost. As we said, the shoe size is lost, not available. Furthermore, the contact of the hand with the clay, for example, produced an imprint, direct imprint of the hand. Now the clay itself might, while it's soft, could still be stretched and compressed, and we'd still recognize the hand there, so it could undergo further modification of a topological kind, warping or compression, and yet still the arrangement of the fingers on the hand, for example, would still be present. So for present purposes, we might call these imprints and distinguish them from symbols. But as we've already found, there's lots of ways in which something can be about something else. When we're talking about something representing something, we're usually using it in the map sense. That is, something that we have in front of us stands in correspondence to something that's not here. But it can only play that role because it occurs within a system, within a bunch of other signs and conventions. And that allows it to play that role. So a circle with a 5-pointed star will never be about Salt Lake City unless it occurs in the context of a map in which that expectation or that interpretation is supported. Notice how different that way of being about something is to the imprints we just looked at. So staying here now with the ecosystem of signs and symbols, the relationship between a representation and the thing that it's about can be completely arbitrary, as for example the letter pi here, which is a Greek alphabetic letter. And if you write in Greek, then pi functions as a letter in the Greek alphabet. But if you're doing mathematics, pi refers to the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. So it has a different meaning when the same black marks occur in a mathematical context than in a Greek linguistic context. The relationship can be somewhat less arbitrary. So there's our prohibition sign, and here we have two examples of how we might use this to prohibit fishing. The fishing element that's been added is very different in each case, but it bears an iconic likeness to the way we think about fishing, either somebody with a fishing rod or the fish itself. So these symbols function within sort of an ecosystem of signs. The no fishing will only work if fishing is a possibility, if it's displayed somewhere close to a river or a lake, for example. And to interpret the pi, we'd have to know whether we're in a Greek language context or a mathematical context. Now, when we were looking at the maps, we noted as well that some elements on the map stand in a completely arbitrary relationship. That's circle with the 5-pointed star is an example. Some are less arbitrary, so the iconic form of the airplane to be about the airport that introduces a visual element of likeness. And then the implicit information in the map about distances, which is very much non-arbitrary, very much principled. So to finish up, let's just ask ourselves what this particular sign means. Again, we're back in the dashboard of a car. We're looking down at the car and we see this fuel gauge, and there's a red marker and it's pointing down towards E. Now you might say, well, this sign is clearly about the amount of petrol in the tank. You wouldn't be wrong. That is one way of saying what this sign is about. You could just as responsibly say, this sign is about the amount of fluid in the tank. There's nothing in the representation here that would distinguish petrol from anything else. The relationship between the meter we're looking at and the fluid in the tank is sufficiently abstract that you could replace the fluid with cooking oil and this meter would still be conveying some information. It could be about something else though. You could interpret this sign as being telling you about the amount of time you have left to carry on driving before you have to get to a petrol station. So representation always includes this notion of interpretation. We've just interpreted this one representation in 3 different ways. And the interpretation is done by somebody in a specific context. So that begins our discussion of representation, and it introduces a variety of themes which we'll now go on to explore in a few different ways.